The transport ship landed on Nexus Prime with barely a sound, as its engines powered down in the massive docking bay that stretched for miles in every direction. Ambassador Lee Taman stepped off the ramp and looked up at the crystal towers that rose into the purple sky like giant fingers reaching toward the stars. Each tower was taller than any building on Earth, and they glowed with soft light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Park Min-ho walked beside him, carrying a simple bag, and looking around with wide eyes at the alien workers who moved cargo with their many arms or floated through the air on wings that shimmered like oil on water. Kim Nari followed quietly behind them, taking notes on a small device, while her sharp eyes watched everything that moved. The three humans looked very ordinary compared to the other beings around them. Taman wore simple gray robes that marked him as a diplomat and carried only a wooden staff that looked like it had been carved from an earth tree. His hair was getting gray at the edges, and he walked slowly like someone who spent too much time reading books instead of exercising. Minho was young and nervous and kept adjusting his glasses while he tried to keep up with all the alien languages being spoken around them. Nari looked like any other cultural worker with her neat clothes and quiet manner. Behind them walked Kang, Do-hyun, who appeared to be nothing more than a simple bodyguard. He was not particularly tall or muscular, and he wore the same gray uniform as the other humans. He carried no visible weapons and moved with the careful steps of someone who did not want to cause trouble. Most of the aliens who glanced at the human group barely noticed him at all. The docking supervisor was a creature with blue skin and 4 eyes who looked at their travel documents with obvious boredom. The stamps and seals meant nothing special to him, since humans were still new to galactic politics and were not considered important by most species. He waved them through without asking any questions. As they walked through the corridors toward the diplomatic quarter, Taman could hear other species talking about the peace negotiations that would begin tomorrow. The Krillian Empire and the Voltari. Federation had been fighting for 3 years over mining rights in the outer spiral, and the war was spreading to other systems. Many smaller species were picking sides or trying to stay neutral, while trade routes became dangerous and resources grew scarce. A group of tall reptilian Krillians passed them in the hallway, and their leader looked down at the humans with yellow eyes that showed clear contempt. The Krillians were natural warriors with thick scales that could stop most energy weapons and muscles that could crush steel. They had conquered dozens of worlds through pure military strength, and they saw diplomacy as something for weak species who could not fight for what they wanted. One of the Krillians said something in their harsh language that made the others laugh, and Minho translated quietly for Taman, who already understood but wanted to know if his aide was paying attention. The Krillian had called humans soft meat, and wondered why they were even allowed in the same building as real warriors. Taman showed no reaction, but Do-hyun shifted slightly behind them in a way that only Nari noticed. She had trained with enough soldiers to recognize when someone was calculating distances and planning movements, even though Do-hyun looked as calm as before. They reached their assigned quarters, which were smaller than what most species received. But the humans had not complained about the arrangement. The rooms were clean and had beds that could be adjusted for human physiology, though the gravity was a bit lighter than Earth normal. Large windows showed the view of the council chambers, which floated in the center of the city like a giant soap bubble made of crystal, and Light Minho unpacked their few belongings, while Nari set up her research equipment to monitor local communications and cultural patterns. She had learned 6 alien languages for this mission and could read the body language of 12 different species well enough to detect lies or hidden intentions. Her official job was to help Taman avoid cultural mistakes during negotiations, but her real training was much more specialized. Taman stood at the window looking at the council chambers and thinking about the briefings he had received on Earth. The Terran Federation had been watching this conflict carefully because it threatened to destabilize the entire region, and Earth had colonies that could be affected. More importantly, the war was being used by radical groups to spread propaganda about how peaceful coexistence between species was impossible. The Voltari were energy beings who lived in crystalline shells and could manipulate electromagnetic fields in ways that seemed like magic to most other species. They were proud of their ancient civilization and looked down on younger species like humans as primitive children who had barely learned to leave their home planet. The Voltari controlled some of the richest energy sources in the galaxy, and the Krillians wanted access to those resources for their growing empire. Neither side really wanted peace, but both were being pressured by the Galactic Council to at least try negotiations because the fighting was disrupting too many trade routes and threatening neutral worlds. The Council had invited several minor species to observe the talks, including humans, who were still considered insignificant enough to be neutral. Do-hyun checked the security systems in their quarters and found them adequate, though not impressive, by human standards. Most alien security was designed to stop brute force attacks or detect energy weapons, but humans had developed much more subtle approaches to both offense and defense. He could see 17 different ways to disable the sensors if needed, and at least 9 escape routes that would not show up on the building plans. That evening, they attended a reception for all the diplomatic delegations where species mixed carefully, according to complex rules about which groups could safely interact. The air was filled with translation devices that converted speech between dozens of languages, though many aliens preferred to use gestures or chemical signals that the machines could not interpret. War Marshal Vextar dominated one side of the room, surrounded by other Krillian officers whose scales had been polished to show their battle scars. He was telling stories about famous victories while his subordinates made approving growls and showed their teeth in what passed for Krillian smiles. His 4 arms moved constantly as he described tactics and strategies that had crushed enemy. Resistance on world after world high, Counselor Zephyra floated near the opposite wall in her crystalline shell that reflected light in patterns that hurt human eyes to look at directly. She was surrounded by other Voltari who communicated through electromagnetic pulses that created aurora displays in the air around them. Their conversation was about the mathematical beauty of energy manipulation and how primitive species could never understand the true elegance of their science. Taemin approached both groups during the evening and spoke briefly with their leaders using careful diplomatic language that committed him to nothing while showing proper respect. His translation device worked perfectly, but both alien leaders seemed surprised that he had bothered to learn basic phrases in their native languages. Vextar tested him by asking about human military traditions, and Taemin replied that Earth preferred to build things rather than destroy them, but that humans understood the necessity of protecting what they had built. Zephyra questioned him about human energy technology, and he admitted honestly that Earth science was far behind Voltari achievements, but that humans were always eager to learn from their betters. Both conversations were exactly what the alien leaders expected from a minor species trying to stay relevant in galactic politics. They dismissed Taemin as another weak diplomat from a weak world that would side with whoever seemed stronger when the negotiations inevitably failed. Other species at the reception included the insectoid Clith, who worked as information brokers, and the gaseous Nephili, who existed partially in dimensions that solid beings could not perceive. All of them treated the humans politely but without real interest, since Earth had little to offer in terms of military power or economic resources. The evening ended, Taemin returned to his quarters and began reviewing files on tomorrow's formal sessions. The peace talks would take place in the Grand Assembly Hall, where artificial gravity could be adjusted for different species, and the environmental controls could create comfortable conditions for beings who breathed everything from methane to pure energy. Minho helped him prepare his opening statement, which would call for compromise and mutual understanding between the Krillians and Voltari. It was the kind of speech that every diplomat gave and everyone expected to be ignored by the actual decision-makers. Nari analyzed the social interactions from the reception and noted several concerning patterns in how certain species were coordinating their movements and communications. Some of the maintenance workers she had observed seemed to be paying too much attention to security procedures and delegate schedules. Do-Yun made his final security sweep and checked the weapons detection systems one more time. Everything appeared normal. But he had learned long ago that normal appearances could be the most dangerous thing of all when dealing with species who thought humans were harmless. The Grand Assembly Hall floated in the exact center of Nexus Prime, like a crystal sphere suspended in space itself with no visible supports holding it up. Taemin and his team traveled there in a transport pod that moved through tubes of pure energy connecting the diplomatic quarter to the council chambers. Through the transparent walls, they could see the city spreading out below them in all directions, with beings from hundreds of worlds going about their daily business. Inside the hall, the artificial gravity shifted constantly to accommodate different species as delegates took their assigned positions around the central speaking area. The Krillians preferred heavy gravity that would crush most beings, while the Voltari needed almost no gravity at all since they could float freely in their energy shells. Humans adapted easily to the changing conditions since Earth gravity was somewhere in the middle of what most species could tolerate. 12 different environmental zones maintained perfect conditions for each delegation, with atmosphere mixtures that ranged from the methane clouds preferred by the Nephili to the high-pressure nitrogen that the rock-like Torvin needed to survive. Translation matrices hung in the air like invisible webs, converting speech and gesture into formats that every species could understand. Taman took his seat in the minor delegate section where humans were placed alongside other species that the Galactic Council considered too weak or unimportant to affect the actual negotiations. The Clith information brokers sat nearby, clicking their mandibles in patterns that conveyed amusement at human presumption in attending such important talks. The crystalline Zephyrite who had been enslaved by the Voltari centuries ago watched everything with the bitter attention of beings who understood that the powerful rarely kept their promises. War Marshal Vexitar entered the chamber with a formation of Krillian warriors whose scales had been polished until they reflected light, like mirrors. Each warrior stood over 8 feet tall and carried ceremonial weapons that could cut through starship hulls. Vexitar himself was even larger than his guards, with battle scars that told the story of 100 victories across the galaxy. His 4 arms moved with the controlled precision of someone who had spent centuries perfecting the art of violence. The War Marshal took his position at the primary speaking platform and immediately began pounding it with his fists while roaring challenges in the Krillian language that made several smaller species retreat to safer distances. His speech was translated instantly, but the raw emotional force of his words needed no interpretation, as he declared that the Krillian Empire would never surrender territory or resources to energy parasites who had grown soft from millennia of hiding behind technology. High Counselor Zephyra entered from the opposite direction, moving through the air like a star given consciousness and wrapped in geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Her crystalline shell pulsed with colors that had no names in most languages, and electromagnetic fields around her created aurora displays that danced through the chamber's atmosphere. She took her position without acknowledging Vexitar's presence, and began speaking in harmonics that resonated through dimensions most beings could not perceive. Her translated words were calm and logical as she explained that the Voltari Federation had controlled the disputed energy sources for over 10,000 years and had developed them responsibly according to principles that primitive species could not understand. She suggested that beings who solved problems through violence were incapable of appreciating the mathematical elegance required for proper resource management. The other major powers in the galaxy watched from their own sections as the 2 primary delegates exchanged what amounted to sophisticated insults while maintaining diplomatic protocol. The ancient hierophants, who claimed to remember the birth of stars, made notes in languages that predated most civilizations. The machine intelligence collective known as the Synthesis calculated probability matrices for every possible outcome. The mysterious watchers, who never spoke aloud, observed everything through senses that operated outside normal space-time. Dr. Yoon Ji-won sat in the scientific observer section, running bioscans on all the delegates through equipment that was much more advanced than it appeared. Her official role was to study alien psychology for human diplomatic training, but her real job was threat assessment using sensors that could detect everything from concealed weapons to altered brain chemistry. She had already identified 16 different ways the negotiations could turn violent and was monitoring stress levels throughout the chamber. Han Seo-jun coordinated human security from a position that gave him clear lines of sight to all major entrances and exit points. He appeared to be just another minor functionary taking notes, but his enhanced vision was tracking movement patterns throughout the facility, while his communication implants kept him connected to security teams that the other species did not. No existed, as the formal opening ceremonies continued with speeches from the Galactic Council's rotating presidency. Nari used her cultural analysis training to read the subtle signals that most beings missed. The way Vexitar's secondary arms moved indicated he was planning something beyond simple negotiation. The electromagnetic fluctuations around Zephyra suggested she was communicating with Voltari agents outside the chamber. Most concerning were the maintenance workers, who seemed to be coordinating their activities according to a schedule that did not match their official duties. When Taman was finally recognized to speak, he stood slowly and walked to the minor delegates' platform carrying his simple wooden staff. His gray robes made him almost invisible against the chamber's crystal walls, and his quiet voice required the translation matrix to amplify his words so everyone could hear them. He began with the standard diplomatic formula, acknowledging the wisdom and power of the major delegates before suggesting that peaceful coexistence served everyone's interests better than continued warfare. His speech lasted exactly 7 minutes and contained nothing that had not been said at 1,000 other peace conferences throughout galactic history. He spoke about mutual benefits and shared prosperity while carefully avoiding any specific proposals that might offend either side. Most delegates ignored him completely since humans had nothing to offer that could influence the real power dynamics between the Krillians and Voltari, but Vextar and Zephyra both noticed something that the other species missed. When Taman spoke their names, he pronounced them correctly in their native languages without using the translation matrix. More importantly, he included subtle grammatical structures that showed he understood not just their words, but the cultural concepts behind them. This level of linguistic skill suggested either extensive study or direct neural interfacing with their communication systems. During the first recess, Taman approached both primary delegates separately to offer informal discussions about possible compromise positions. He spoke to Vextar in the ancient Krillian battle tongue that was normally used only between warriors who had proven themselves in combat. He addressed Zephyra using mathematical harmonics that most solid beings could not produce without technological assistance. Neither conversation lasted more than a few minutes, but both alien leaders found themselves reconsidering their assumptions about human capabilities. Vextar had never met a non-Krillian who could speak the warrior dialect without electronic aid. Zephyra was surprised that any organic being could generate the precise frequency modulations required for advanced Voltari mathematics. What neither realized was that Taman was using psychological techniques developed from decades of studying alien cognitive patterns. Each phrase was carefully crafted to plant suggestions below the level of conscious awareness, while appearing to be simple diplomatic courtesy. The human understanding of alien psychology had advanced far beyond what most species suspected. Dr. Jiwan's bioscanners detected unusual activity in the facility's lower levels, where maintenance tunnels connected to the chamber's support systems. Her readings showed elevated stress hormones and concealed metal objects that did not match the building's structural requirements. She quietly transmitted her findings to Seojun, who began deploying human security personnel to investigate Nari. Observed that several species who normally avoided each other were making brief contact through intermediaries positioned throughout the observer sections. The pattern suggested coordination for some kind of group activity, though she could not determine the specific purpose. Her intelligence training recognized the signs of an operation in progress, but the target and timing remained unclear. As the second session began with more formal speeches about historical grievances and legal precedents, Do-Yun noticed that some of the maintenance workers had changed positions in ways that gave them better access to critical systems. His enhanced hearing detected conversations in languages that were not being translated by the chamber's systems, indicating private communications between groups that should not have been working together. The hegemony of Pure Flame had spent months infiltrating the facility by replacing legitimate workers with their own operatives and corrupting security systems through carefully placed electronic viruses. Their plan was to strike during the negotiations when all the major delegates would be present in one location with their guard down. The explosion came from deep beneath the Grand Assembly Hall and shook the entire structure with force that made several delegates stumble and cry out in their native languages. Emergency lights bathed the chamber in red warning signals, while automated systems announced containment protocols in dozens of different communication formats. The artificial gravity fluctuated wildly as power systems struggled to maintain stability and environmental controls began failing in sections throughout the complex. Seojun was already moving before the first echo faded as his enhanced reflexes responded to threats his conscious mind had not yet processed. Through his communication implants, he received reports from human security teams positioned throughout the facility, confirming that the explosion had been deliberately set in the main power distribution center. Secondary explosions followed in rapid sequence, targeting backup systems and escape routes in a pattern that showed detailed knowledge of the building's construction. Emergency barriers slammed down across all major entrances and exits, sealing the Grand Assembly Hall according to standard security protocols designed to protect important delegates during crisis situations. The massive crystal walls that had seemed so beautiful now became a prison as blast shields covered the windows and force fields activated around the chamber's perimeter. What should have been a refuge from external threats had become a trap. With nowhere to run, armed figures in environmental suits poured through maintenance access points that should have been impossible to reach without authorization codes and biometric clearance. Their weapons were a mixture of energy rifles and projectile systems designed to work against different types of alien physiology and defensive technology. Each assault team moved with military precision, suggesting professional training and detailed planning, rather than random terrorist activity. War Marshal Vex Tar roared orders in the Krillian battle language as his personal guards formed a defensive circle around their delegation, using their natural armor and ceremonial weapons to create a barrier against incoming fire. The Krillian warriors were bred for combat, and their thick scales could absorb energy weapon strikes that would kill most other species, but even they were vulnerable to the advanced munitions being used by the attackers, High Counselor Zephyras. Electromagnetic shields flared to life, creating a dome of crackling energy that deflected the first wave of attacks aimed at the Voltari delegation. Her crystalline shell pulsed with mathematical patterns as she calculated defensive algorithms, while other Voltari began generating interference fields to disrupt the terrorists' targeting systems. Their technology was superior to most species, but required time and concentration to reach full effectiveness. The chamber filled with smoke and energy discharges as beings from dozens of worlds found themselves trapped in a battle they had not expected and were not prepared for. The insectoid Clith tried to burrow into the floor using their natural digging instincts, but the chamber's construction materials were too strong for their claws. The gaseous Nephili attempted to phase into other dimensions, but found their escape. Routes blocked by force fields operating on frequencies they could not avoid. Dr. Jiwan activated emergency medical protocols while taking cover behind equipment that had been designed to withstand environmental hazards, but not military weapons. Her bioscanners were overloaded with readings from injured beings whose alien physiology she was trained to understand but had never treated under combat conditions. She began prioritizing casualties based on species-specific trauma responses. While calling for medical assistance that might never arrive, Praetor Xenthul emerged from his hiding place as his crystalline body began absorbing energy from the violence and fear filling the chamber. His species had evolved to feed on conflict, and the current situation was providing him with more sustenance than he had experienced in decades. The hegemony of pure flame had planned this assault not just to restart the war between the Krillians and Voltari, but to prove that peaceful coexistence was impossible when stronger beings were willing to take what they wanted. His followers came from 17 different species, united by the belief that diplomacy was weakness, and that only through constant warfare could civilizations grow strong enough to survive in a hostile galaxy. They had infiltrated the peace negotiations specifically to destroy any possibility of compromise and to broadcast the execution of major delegates as proof that only military strength mattered. The terrorists began systematically eliminating the guards protecting each delegation, starting with the species they considered most dangerous in combat. Krillian warriors fell under concentrated fire from weapons designed to penetrate their natural armor, while Voltari energy shields were overloaded by electromagnetic pulse devices that disrupted their technological advantages. Other species found their defensive capabilities overwhelmed by tactics specifically developed to counter their natural abilities. Nari had immediately recognized the attack pattern as a professional military operation rather than random violence and began analyzing enemy positions to identify command structures and tactical weaknesses. Her intelligence training included combat assessment techniques that most cultural attachés would never need, but her real background prepared her for exactly this kind of situation. The chamber's translation systems had been damaged in the initial explosions, leaving most delegates unable to communicate effectively with beings from other species. Fear and confusion spread as various groups tried to coordinate defensive actions using gesture and basic universal languages, while the terrorists took advantage of the communication breakdown to isolate targets. Do-hyun remained motionless near Taemin's position, watching the battle unfold with the calm attention of someone evaluating options rather than panicking about survival. His enhanced senses tracked every movement in the chamber, while his tactical analysis systems calculated threat levels and response possibilities faster than most organic minds could process conscious thought. Several alien delegates looked toward The human delegation, expecting to see the typical panic response of a weak species caught in violence beyond their capability to handle. Humans were supposed to be soft creatures who solved problems through talking rather than fighting, and who would naturally seek surrender when faced with overwhelming force. Instead, they saw Taemin walking slowly toward the center of the chamber, with his hands raised but his expression completely calm as plasma bolts and energy beams crossed the air around him. He moved with the measured pace of someone who was not afraid of the weapons being fired or the beings firing them. His wooden staff remained in his grip as if it was the most natural thing in the galaxy to carry a simple piece of carved wood into a high-tech battle. Xenthal noticed the humans' approach and felt satisfaction that at least one species was responding appropriately to superior force by attempting surrender. The crystalline being's species considered capitulation to be the first step toward proper natural selection, as weak civilizations eliminated themselves rather than waste resources in hopeless resistance. Taemin stopped exactly in the geometric center of the chamber, where all the various gravity fields and environmental systems intersected in perfect balance. His voice carried clearly through the chaos, without any technological amplification, as he spoke words that most of the aliens did not understand, but that made Do-hyun's entire posture change instantly. The phrase he used was in human military terminology, and it activated protocols that had been established decades ago when Earth first began sending diplomats to potentially dangerous situations throughout the galaxy. What the other species had never realized was that the Terran Federation never sent anyone anywhere without protection that could handle whatever threats they might encounter. Protocol 7 was humanity's most classified diplomatic authority, and it had never been used in the presence of alien witnesses before this moment. When activated by an accredited ambassador, it temporarily declassified the security detail assigned to protect human interests and authorized the use of any force necessary to ensure the safety of Terran Federation personnel and their allies. Do-hyun shed his careful disguise as a mild-mannered bodyguard and became something that no alien species had ever seen before. Enhanced muscle systems activated throughout his body, while neural acceleration increased his reaction time beyond what most beings could comprehend. Weapons systems built into his seemingly ordinary clothing came online as reactive armor began, hardening against energy weapons and projectile attacks. Nari revealed that her role as cultural attaché had been cover for someone whose real training involved moving through zero-gravity environments like a force of nature while disabling opponents, using techniques developed specifically for each known alien species. Her enhanced physiology allowed her to survive in atmospheric conditions that would kill normal humans, while her weapon systems were designed to work against every type of defensive technology in the galactic database. The wooden staff in Taemin's hands transformed into a command console that linked him directly to systems that most aliens did not know existed. Communication channels opened to human military assets positioned throughout the local star system, while tactical data began flowing from sensors that had been monitoring the situation since before the Do-hyun moved like liquid death through the zero-gravity environment as his enhanced systems analyzed each terrorist's species and selected the most efficient method to disable them without causing unnecessary damage to the chamber or the delegates they were supposed to protect. His first target was a hegemony operative whose carapace armor was designed to resist energy weapons, but had a structural weakness that human intelligence had identified years ago during xenobiological studies. The enhanced human's fingertips found the exact pressure point where the alien's nerve cluster connected to its motor control systems and applied precise force that instantly paralyzed the creature without permanent damage. The terrorist's weapon clattered away as Do-hyun was already moving toward his next target while calculating trajectory patterns that would put him in optimal position for each subsequent engagement. Nari flowed through the complex gravity fields, like someone who had trained in three-dimensional combat since childhood rather than someone who was supposed to be a cultural expert studying alien social customs. Her enhanced reflexes allowed her to dodge energy blasts, while her reactive armor absorbed impacts that would have vaporized normal human tissue. She reached a group of terrorists who were advancing on the Voltari delegation and demonstrated why human military doctrine emphasized adaptability over raw firepower. Each alien species had evolved different combat instincts and defensive capabilities, but humans had studied them all and developed specific techniques to counter every known biological advantage. The reptilian Krillian terrorist found his natural armor useless against pressure point attacks that targeted his species' unique nervous system, while the energy-based Voltari operative discovered that humans had learned to disrupt electromagnetic fields using methods that seemed impossible to other solid beings. The hegemony forces had expected resistance from the alien delegates and their guards, but they had prepared for conventional combat using tactics and weapons that worked against known galactic military doctrine. They had not prepared for beings who fought like humans, fought with techniques that adapted instantly to whatever defensive measures their opponents used. Seo Jun led the second wave of human security personnel who had been disguised as maintenance, workers and cultural observers throughout the complex since before the peace negotiations began. They moved through the facility with the efficiency of people who had memorized every corridor and access point, while the terrorists' own infiltration route became a trap that closed around them from all directions. The hidden human command post activated sensors that had been monitoring hegemony communications since their first operative entered the building weeks ago. Every terrorist position was known and tagged while their weapons capabilities had been analyzed and countered before the first shot was fired. What the aliens had thought was a surprise attack had been anticipated and prepared for with the thorough planning that humans applied to everything they considered important. Captain Lim Sora received authorization to deploy her special operations teams from the stealth ship Guangzhou's Pride, which had been positioned just outside the system's sensor detection range since the human delegation arrived. The ship itself was an example of human technology that no alien species suspected existed, as it used principles that made it effectively invisible to every known detection method while carrying enough firepower to level continents. The terrorists' exotic energy weapons, which had been specifically designed to penetrate known alien defensive systems, had minimal effect on human reactive armor that adapted to each attack by analyzing the energy patterns and restructuring its molecular composition to provide optimal protection. Their psychological warfare tactics, which were calculated to induce panic responses in alien neural patterns, only seemed to make the humans more focused and efficient. Praetor Zenthal realized too late that his carefully planned assault had become a trap that was closing around his forces with mechanical precision. His species fed on conflict energy, but the type of violence the humans were displaying was unlike anything he had experienced before. There was no rage or fear to sustain him, only cold calculation and perfect execution that felt more like watching machines than organic beings. The crystalline being tried to coordinate his remaining forces, but found that human jammers were disrupting his communication systems, while human tactical analysis was predicting his moves before he made them. Every order he gave was countered before it could be implemented, while his operatives were being systematically disabled by opponents who seemed to know exactly how to fight each species. War Marshal Vextar watched the human security team work and felt something he had never experienced before in decades of military campaigns. The humans moved with a precision that made his own elite warriors look clumsy, while their tactics showed a level of preparation that suggested they had been planning for this exact situation for years. More disturbing was the realization that they were holding back their full capabilities to avoid collateral damage. High Counselor Zafira's mathematical mind processed the tactical data her sensors were collecting and reached conclusions that challenged her species' fundamental assumptions about human intelligence and capability. The energy patterns the humans were using suggested technology that was decades ahead of what Earth was supposed to possess, while their combat efficiency indicated training methods that most species had never developed. Dr. Jiwan worked to stabilize wounded delegates while marveling at how her security team had managed to neutralize threats throughout the chamber without causing any casualties among the beings they were protecting. The precision required to fight a battle in a confined space filled with fragile alien dignitaries was beyond what most military forces could achieve even under ideal conditions. The hegemony terrorists found themselves facing opponents who seemed to anticipate every move while countering every tactic with responses that were perfectly calibrated to each species involved. Their advanced weapons became useless against armor that adapted faster than they could adjust their targeting, while their superior numbers meant nothing against enemies who could disable multiple opponents simultaneously. Do-hyun reached the position where Praetor Senthul was trying to rally his remaining forces, and the crystalline being discovered that his natural ability to absorb energy from conflict was useless against someone who could fight without generating the emotional responses. that sustained his species. The human moved with the calm efficiency of someone performing routine maintenance rather than engaging in life-or-death combat. The wooden staff in Taemin's hands continued to coordinate the human response while providing real-time tactical analysis to every team member throughout the facility. What had appeared to be a simple ceremonial object revealed capabilities that suggested human technology was far more advanced than any alien species had suspected. Nari disabled the last group of terrorists who had been trying to reach the emergency communication systems to broadcast their message of supremacist ideology to the galaxy. Her enhanced reflexes allowed her to move faster than their targeting systems could track, while her tactical analysis identified exactly which components of their equipment needed to be damaged to prevent any transmission. The battle lasted exactly 17 minutes and 12 seconds from the first explosion to the moment when Seojin reported that all hegemony operatives were either neutralized or contained. 0 casualties among the diplomatic delegations and minimal structural damage to the Grand Assembly Hall, despite the terrorists' use of weapons designed to cause maximum destruction, as the smoke cleared and emergency lighting was replaced by normal illumination. The gathered alien delegates found themselves staring at a scene that challenged everything they thought they knew about human capabilities and human intentions. The beings they had dismissed as weak and primitive had just demonstrated military efficiency that surpassed anything most of them had witnessed in their lifetimes. But Taemin was not finished with his demonstration of what humans were capable of when they chose to act rather than simply observe. The silence that followed the end of combat was more profound than any sound as hundreds of beings from dozens of species tried to process what they had just witnessed. Medical teams moved through the chamber treating the wounded while security forces processed the captured terrorists, but the alien delegates remained frozen in place, staring at the humans who had just redefined the concept of military capability. War Marshal Vextar stood among his warriors who were supposed to be the finest soldiers in the galaxy, and realized that he had just watched beings who made his elite forces look like untrained children. The precision and efficiency the humans had displayed suggested not just superior training, but an entirely different approach to warfare that his species had never encountered, despite conquering dozens of world's high counselors. Ephira's crystalline shell pulsed with electromagnetic patterns that indicated profound confusion mixed with something that might have been fear if her species was capable of such emotions. Her advanced sensors had recorded energy signatures and tactical data that contradicted everything the Voltari Federation believed about human technology and human intelligence. The other species representatives whispered among themselves in languages that the translation systems were finally working to process as emergency repairs restored communication throughout the chamber. The ancient hierophants, who claimed to have witnessed the rise and fall of galactic civilizations, admitted to each other that they had never seen anything like human combat doctrine. The machine intelligence collective known as the Synthesis ran probability calculations that kept producing results their logic systems insisted were impossible. Praetor Zenthul lay contained in a specialized force field that disrupted his species' ability to absorb energy from conflict, while human security personnel prepared him for transportation to a detention facility that could handle beings whose physiology existed partially outside normal space-time. His crystalline body no longer glowed with the satisfaction of feeding on violence, because the humans had fought without generating the emotional energy his kind required for sustenance. Dr. Jiwon finished treating the last of the wounded delegates and began collecting biological data from the terrorist attack using equipment that was far more sophisticated than anything most species had developed for field medicine. Her analysis would help improve human defensive preparations for future encounters with hostile alien technology, while providing intelligence about species they might need to fight again. Taemin walked slowly to the main communication console in the center of the chamber, carrying his transformed staff, which continued to display tactical information from human assets throughout the star system. His gray robes were not even dirty, despite the battle that had raged around him, while his calm expression suggested that everything had proceeded exactly according to his expectations. He activated communication channels that reached every government and military installation within 50 light years, while recording systems throughout the chamber documented his words for later analysis by intelligence agencies across the galaxy. What he said next would be studied by alien strategists for decades as they tried to understand the implications of human capabilities they had never suspected. His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who spoke for a civilization that was far more dangerous than anyone had realized, while his words were carefully chosen to reshape galactic political dynamics without declaring war on species that had simply made the mistake of underestimating Earth. The transmission included tactical footage from the engagement that had been edited to show human capabilities without revealing the specific techniques or technologies that made such performance possible. Every military analyst in known space would spend years trying to reverse engineer what they had witnessed while failing to understand the principles that made human combat doctrine so effective. He spoke about humanity's commitment to diplomatic solutions and peaceful coexistence while making it clear that this commitment existed because humans possessed alternatives that other species would prefer never to experience. The demonstration they had just witnessed was described as a protective measure rather than an aggressive action, while the implications were left for each government to analyze according to their own strategic interests. The camera focused on Taemin's face as he explained that human strength was dedicated to defending peace rather than conquering territory or enslaving populations like some species had chosen to do throughout galactic history. But his quiet words carried an unmistakable message that anyone who threatened human civilians or human allies would discover capabilities that made today's demonstration look restrained within hours of the transmission being broadcast across. The Galaxy 37 worlds requested immediate diplomatic meetings with Earth, while dozens of governments began reassessing their military preparations and strategic assumptions. The Krillian Empire sent messages asking about defense treaties, while the Voltari Federation inquired about technology-sharing agreements that they had previously considered beneath their notice. Admiral Song Jiho appeared as a holographic projection. In Taemin's private chambers, after the formal sessions had been suspended pending investigation of the terrorist attack. Her uniform displayed decorations from military campaigns that most alien species had never heard of, while her report detailed the strategic changes already rippling through galactic politics. The hidden human fleet that had been protecting Earth's diplomatic missions throughout the galaxy began receiving communications from criminal organizations that were offering to surrender rather than risk attracting human attention. Intelligence agencies reported that 12 different terrorist cells had disbanded immediately after viewing the tactical footage, while pirate groups in 3-star systems had ceased operations pending further evaluation of human capabilities. Minho reviewed diplomatic cables that were arriving faster than the translation systems could process them as governments across the galaxy attempted to establish better relationships with a species they now realized they had seriously misjudged. Trade offers that had been rejected for decades were being renewed with significantly improved terms, while military partnerships that Earth had been excluded from were suddenly opening their membership. Nari analyzed the social and psychological impact of the day's events using data collected from every species present during the terrorist attack. Her assessment indicated that most alien governments would now approach humans with a mixture of respect and caution, rather than the dismissive attitude that had characterized previous interactions. Seojun submitted security reports that documented how human preparation and planning had turned what should have been a devastating attack into a demonstration of protective capability that would influence galactic politics for generations. His teams had achieved their objectives without a single human casualty, while ensuring that every alien delegate survived to report what they had witnessed. Do-hyun completed his post-mission analysis and began preparing for the next phase of diplomatic protection as Earth's role in galactic affairs shifted from minor participant to major power that other species would need to accommodate in their strategic planning. His enhanced systems were already processing intelligence about potential threats to human interests throughout the galaxy. Taemin looked through the vast windows of his quarters at the ships from dozens of species approaching the council station. With diplomatic flags rather than weapons, he reflected on humanity's long journey from a single world to a civilization that could reshape galactic politics through the careful application of strength in defense of peace. The message he composed for transmission to Earth was brief and understated in the way that human military communications traditionally avoided dramatic language, even when reporting events that changed the course of history. His words were simple and direct as he informed his government that the galaxy was finally ready to listen to what humanity had been trying to tell them about the benefits of cooperation over conquest. tomorrow the real negotiations would begin. As species that had spent millennia fighting over resources and territory discovered that there might be alternatives to eternal warfare when someone strong enough to enforce peace was willing to protect those who chose diplomacy over violence, the galaxy would never be the same, because one species had proven that the most dangerous beings were often those who appeared least threatening, until someone made the mistake of threatening what they were sworn to protect.